3 times a minute, but I'm not going to go that fast, both for safety reasons and so that you can see all the various things that are required to load this piece. So if I was to order my piece, hold like this, you see I'm holding it in my left hand and it's going to be burning down. I'm going to be constantly blowing on it to keep that match lit. That's called tending your match. Musketeers, make ready your piece is the order. I will then pop open one of my bottles filled with gunpowder. Open the priming pan. You can see I have a cover on that. That's to keep loose powder from flying away while I'm preparing the rest of the musket. I will open that. I will then check to make sure there is no sparks in there, because that would be really bad if I pour a bunch of gunpowder on lit sparks. Having cleared that out with my finger, I will then prime my piece, pulling that down, pulling just a little bit of gunpowder, enough to ignite the charge. Down there, close my pan. Now this is very important. Cast off loose corns. There's still a little bit of gunpowder residue just remaining right there, so I'm going to want to blow those off and cast them off. So cast off and blow loose corns. Cast about your piece. I pushed it back like this. I then have the rest of my charge, handle my charge, pour it down the barrel. I will then, in theory, reach into my bullet bag, pull out a bullet, or if I'm an experienced musketeer, I'm holding them in my cheek and I spit one down. Got that down there. I then withdraw my scouring stick, shorten my scouring stick. This is later known as a ramrod, but at the time we were talking about a scouring stick. Ram home my charge, withdraw my scouring stick, shorten it, palm it back, and the gun is almost ready to fire. Now I cast about my piece, present my piece. I then take that match, make sure that my coal is still good. I tend my match. I then make ready my piece. I try my match, which means that I put it down to make sure that it is going to land approximately in that position, and then I cover my pan with my 2 fingers. One final safety mechanism, one that results in a lot of burns, but what can you do? And so then I am ready to fire. I will then make sure that I am not going to shoot anybody I don't intend to shoot. I will then present my piece, open my pan, have a care, give, fire. In theory. Try that again. Close my pan. Oh.
So it should go bang?
It should go bang. Draw my match, open that up, present my piece, have a care, give, fire.
There we go.
There we go.
So the numbers are on our side. Maybe not here, but for every one of us they kill, 2 more show up on the next boat. For every Indian warrior we kill, it takes a generation to replace them. End result, we're coming out ahead ultimately. And they start to realize this about 2 years in. We're not going anywhere, and there's always more of us. So the Indians go to the governor and they said, hey governor, how about peace breaks out and we'll all get along? Well, after what happened 2 years ago, right? Where's the governor going with that? Oh yeah, brilliant idea. Let's have a toast. And he hands them poisoned wine.
Really?
That happened over at West Point. Yep. They didn't get Opechancanough. The war will continue for another 10 years, total of 12. And then we force a peace treaty on them. Oh, thank God we're done killing each other, right? 10 years on, exact same trick again. Another surprise attack. This time they're going to get 500 instead of 350. But again, remember, numbers, guys. Now there's 5,000 of us here. Numbers are on our side.
Well, now, did the Indians think of uniting with other Indians, even if the Powhatan tribe wasn't?
Well,
other side.
Powhatan is...
or if it was a group of tribes, but
yeah, exactly.
I mean, at that point, if they had brought in enough...
Well, see, there's the problem, because the guys to the west, like the Monacans, they don't like the Powhatans.
Oh, okay.
The guys to the northwest, the Susquehannocks, they don't like the Powhatans. They all want this area. So they're all fighting each other.
So they're not really united, say like the Iroquois up in New York were, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Powhatan's confederation, empire, kingdom, whatever you want to call it, none of them actually are directly accurate. But he comes to power with 6 tribes that he inherits from his mother. He takes that up over 30 by the time we get here. And that's a pretty huge number. The Powhatans are interesting militarily from a couple things. Not only that he's able to bring them all together, and as Randall is fond of saying, they didn't all come for coffee and donuts, okay? He conquered these people. But one of the more interesting things is John Smith and some others are visiting with the Indians at one point, and the Indian women, of all people, show a mock battle. And that mock battle uses what would be considered European techniques. They're doing pincer movements and things like that. So they're encircling the folks playing the enemy. They draw them in, the center falls back, the attack comes, they circle, and then decimate the enemy. This is very typical of what you see in Europe and other places around the world. But it's incredibly unusual for the Americans. We don't see that, at least in North America. We might see it down Central South America, but you're not seeing it up here, and yet Powhatan's people are doing this. So there's some interesting little things going on there that we're not sure on.
So their tactics were advanced, even if their weapons were stony. Now, at any point did they get, did they copy English weapons to improve their
Well,
weapons?
they don't have the capability to make that. They don't have the capability to use it without capturing powder and shot and match. Okay, so they're going to use their traditionals. But this, compared, that's the show them your butts move.
Oh, okay. I had the wrong button in mind.
There you go. Like I say, you can see why the fourth graders love that.
The kids were thinking.
But the musket becomes a war trophy. Now, early on, there's Indians being taught how to use it, and everybody and their brother gets blamed. Anybody who was anybody gets blamed for showing the Indians how to use these things. Near as we can tell, looking at all the records, it was Mariah Wingfield who teaches an Indian to hunt for him. But they blame Dale and Argyle and Yardley and Wingfield, and I mean, just all the way down the line.
Where'd they get the gunpowder?
He's issuing it to him to go hunt wildfowl.
Well, now, did anybody show the Indians how to make gunpowder?
No.
So
In
nobody
fact,
showed them that.
supposedly, at one point, Opechancanough gets a hold of some gunpowder, and looking at it, knowing exactly what he's looking at it, he plants it. You ever see tobacco seed? Looks just like gunpowder. 1 teaspoon of tobacco seed will plant 5 acres. That's how small it is. So he looks at this stuff and goes, oh, okay, I'll just grow some more. Obviously, that didn't
that
work.
doesn't work.
Yeah.
He can't figure out how to make it just from seed.
Exactly. And that's not something we're going to tell them. Same thing with the match. They have no idea how to make the match. But they're not at as much of a disadvantage as you think. Like I say, same accuracy at 40 yards that we have, and a much higher rate of fire. 10 to 12 shots a minute compared to 2 to 3.
You mean their bows and arrows. But now, unless we had given them metal arrowheads, they would have only had stone arrows.
Exactly, wood, bone, and stone. In 1610, a fellow by the name of John Smith, not that one, is going to write a book called Gun versus Bow. It's published in England. I have read a copy. I've never managed to get one. It's a little pamphlet. It's not big. But he will write a book arguing that the bow is better than the musket.
Well,
And
that makes sense.
in 1610, he is absolutely correct. The English longbow is better than the musket.
At some point, guns would become better than bows. I'm not sure when that happens.
It's not the gun that's better,
Or
it's the training time. I can make a musketeer in 2 weeks. It takes a lifetime to make an archer.
Okay, well, that was already true even
Right.
then.
Right. So that's why the
Takes
bow,
a lifetime to make an archer.
to make a real archer, a proper one,
well,
you know, a guy who's going to take an English bow, press it out there, and 300 yards away, he's splitting a pole. Yeah. Yeah, that's a lifetime.
Wow.
And I've seen that done.
The rate of fire.
Now,
some might say that Bridget Croft were not the luckiest person, but I tell you, truth be told, compared to many of the others, she did succeed in her goal here. For she married, and she wound up to marry well. It may not have appeared at the time, but eventually her husband, a most vigorous and energetic man, did greatly succeed. He wound up, so Bridget Croft we know very little of. We know her father was deceased, but we know not what his trade were, how he made his living. We know not what skills she had. Some of the other women are described with skills, but she is not. But she came from Wiltshire in England, so she's a country girl, and country girls are what we need here in Virginia. For if you look about yourself, you will see naught but country. After all, Virginia, there is no London here in Virginia. So what is the good of knowing how to go to market and pick the best fruit and vegetables when you know not how to grow them? We have no markets. So, like the others, she came over, as with many of them, upon the war week. Probably landing in Jamestown, staying there over Christmastide, which was soon after they arrived. But she wound up traveling instead to probably to Bennett's Welcome, which was Edward Bennett's new plantation near Burwell's Bay. So downriver from Jamestown, not up as many of the other plantations were. We think she were there because that is where her husband-to-be, Mr. John Wilkins, is shown as living. He has arrived here 3 years before, in 16 and 18. He probably paid his own way, as he is shown as neither a tenant nor as a servant, but we don't know that for certain. But we do know that in March of 16 and 22, he was there. Now, if Bridget had arrived before that, we do not know if they had perhaps talked on some of the cold winter evenings of how he intended to prosper here, or whether they only met after the great attack by the naturals. That is what we call those who were here before us. Sometimes tragedy brings people together, and so maybe it were with them. Perhaps they ran and fled together. Perhaps they fought together. Perhaps they hid together. But we know not, but by 16 and 24, they had relocated, being some of the lucky ones who escaped from Bennett's Welcome, 53 having died there that day, upon March 22nd. But they were relocated to the eastern shore, which were not well populated at the time, but were seen as a friendlier territory for the king there, sometimes called the Laughing King of the Accomac, were much friendlier to the English than was Opechancanough. And by 16 and 33, they had been married almost 10 years. He had 500 acres upon King's Creek, good land right next to the secretary's land. And over time, he gains another 500 acres there on the seaside, for King's Creek is on the bay side of the eastern shore, and another 300 acres in what would today be Surrey. So he has gone from very little, for in 16 and 24, he was shown as having but one building, one musket, and a few barrels of corn. By 16 and 33, he is the Burgess representing Accomac. And he does earn for himself the title of master. Master meaning from which Mr. today comes. Folk who are not gentlemen have no titles. They are called only John Wilkins. Sadly, Bridget dies in probably 1634 or 1635. And by 1636, he is married again. But he and Bridget have a daughter who lives. And by the time he dies in 1650, he manages to leave the daughter a bed with bolster and sheets and blankets and rugs, a board, a table like this with cloth and napkins, pewter plates and spoons. A truly bounteous bequest, given that he has 6 other children. So she married well, and I wonder if the reason that it be so is, unlike some of those who came with more skills and of a higher place in society, she seems to have come from a lower sort. And so she perhaps saw the potential in a young man who he himself had nothing, but had the skills to succeed here.
Much an evolving story of research, and research overturning older research, and erroneous information, and even slander. We didn't even know Adria Hoare Harris's maiden name for sure until 1996, when the Jamestown Society genealogist Lyndon Hart published an article that made a very strong case for the Adria, who had been mentioned in later patents simply by her first name as Thomas Harris's first wife. We just didn't know her last name. We didn't know her surname up until this point. And Lyndon Hart made a strong case for her being Adria Hoare. That's spelled Hoare. It's pronounced Hoare. And it was right there in the Farrar Papers. It was right there in the list of the passengers on the Marmaduke. 1621 in August, she headed over here. She was only 17, but she fibbed a bit, told them she was 19, and she's one of the few of the Tobacco Brides that came over in 1621 who had both parents living. So why come over, you might ask? Well, the economic situation in England was not good. The economy was in a slump. Cloth trade was really a mess. Wages were low. Population was high. And let's face it, Adria was the youngest in a very large family of daughters. So you're talking about a lot of dowries that families got to come up with eventually if they're going to marry off their daughters. And if they don't marry off their daughters, well, another mouth to feed, right? So her sister, her married sister Joan, who lived in London, recommended. She was recommended by several people actually, but she's the one who brought her to the ship, and she passed the muster, as it were, being an honestly educated and virtuous young woman. So off she goes. But the funny thing about it is that there's a lot of controversy and contradiction associated with her story from that point on. Because you see, prior to discovering that her last name was Hoare, many researchers felt it must surely be Gurganey. She must be Adria or Audrey Gurganey because, again, of another land patent, land record, land transfer from a widow in the colony named Anne Gurganey. And her husband had been an ancient planter, and when he died, he left her the land. Well, apparently she left the land to Thomas Harris after she died in a 1619 will. And people were like, why? Why did she leave it to him? There must be some relation. Perhaps her daughter was Adria Gurganey. Well, this Adria Gurganey was a total fictitious character. She did not exist. But at one point, researchers thought there must be a link because of that Gurganey land transfer in the will. Well, there's several theories about that, and one of the most interesting ones comes from Philip Harris, who is a Harris family researcher. He believes it's possible that Adria was married to someone else prior to Thomas Harris when she first came off the boat. And we know for a fact that she ended up with Thomas Harris. And we know for a fact that they had a child, first child probably in 1625, Mary. But we don't know exactly when they were married. There's a gap there between 1621 and 1625. No records. We do know they both obviously survived the massacre of 1622. But again, there's a lack of records there. And Philip Harris actually has theorized that she may have been married beforehand to another colonist, and it may in fact have been a fellow named George Grimes, who passed away within a year of the massacre, just after the massacre, within the following year. And if that's the case, he was an ancient planter, and she would have inherited his ancient planter status. Now, what ancient planter status involves is it was kind of a way of paying off the initial adventurers for their investment after the Virginia Company was dissolved. It involved anybody who came here before 1616 and paid their passage and stayed here for 3 years could be called an ancient planter and could be given 100 acres, or a little bit later it was 50, for that status. So in later years, long after Adria was dead, we find Thomas Harris in the records claiming 100 extra acres on behalf of his first wife, Adria, as an ancient planter. Well, how could she be an ancient planter? She didn't get here till 1621, and the cutoff date for ancient planter status is 1616. So you see there's a huge controversy there. And the order of the descendants of ancient planters to this day do recognize her as an ancient planter, but how does she get the status? Again, Philip Harris, one of our family researchers, and by the way, she is my 10th great-grandmother, says that possibly she was married before to an ancient planter, and that status, she would have inherited his status, basically, and therefore Thomas, by marrying her, could claim lands against her. So there is that. As far as the Gurgani mystery is involved, there's also the possibility that Lyndon Hart mentions, and again, he's the Jamestown Society genealogist. He thinks that perhaps the first wife that was mentioned as being an ancient planter in that later land patent was perhaps not Adria after all. That could have been error. Perhaps he was even married to the Gurgani woman, and we don't know that. She was a widow at that point. And she would have had ancient planter status too, because her late husband had ancient planter status. So therefore, there are a couple of ways she could have, or he could have claimed ancient planter status when he chose the extra, to get the extra land that way. Now, he himself, Thomas Harris, was an ancient planter. He was just a bit of a land-hungry dude. So any way he could get a little extra land, he was going to do it. And yes, I am talking my 10th great-grandfather here. But anyway, her story is interesting because she is one of the few women in the Farrar Papers who's described in a little detail. I mean, it was useful for the men who were going to be seeking these women as wives to have women who had working skills that they could, really put to use here once they got here. And even though she was only 17, she came from Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, which is a lace-making area. And she comes from a family who are kind of associated with textiles. Her father was a cordwainer, which is a shoemaker. And she has a brother who's an apprentice to a fustian dresser. I believe she has a cousin who is an upholsterer in Cornwall. But again, not a very wealthy family, just they have good character, very honest people, and highly recommended. But her skills, as outlined in the Farrar Papers, are button making, all manner of buttons, black work, which I have some examples here, and plain work. And black work is an interesting thing. It's very beautiful. I don't know if you've ever been to Jamestown settlement, where they still have the jacket that was made for the commemoration of Pocahontas's or Rebecca Rolfe's wedding, but it's covered with black work, and this is an example here. Some of these buttons are really quite interesting, and I'm hoping we'll get some children today so I can tell them about the different types. Thread buttons that were used for shirt sleeves and things. They're nice and soft, so you can sleep in the shirts and the smocks, as the women and men were doing. Easy to wash. Dorset wheels, and the more complex ball and knob buttons, which you would sometimes see on the waistcoats and things like that. There's a singleton button as well. So, and I also have here some wool that I actually spun. The maids were sent over with some provisions by the Virginia Company, and in all they estimated it cost about 12 pounds English to provision them for their journeys, which were a 3-month journey on ship. And some of the things that they sent with them, aside from one waistcoat, which is like this jacket, and one petticoat, 2 pairs of stockings, and 2 smocks, which is to say like a shift. They also sent like darning wool, knitting wool, and things that they could use either on shipboard or when they got to the other side. So there are different things that they were provisioned with, but there was still a profit being made, because 12 pounds, put into it, and on the other end of it, you're talking 120 or 150 pounds of best leaf tobacco was the bride price. So there is a profit.